Hello. This is my first attempt at a full run through of my show, Delivering the Impossible. I'm going to take the order of the introduction at random. You'll see me picking the tickets out for that. And then I'm going to select some subjects. I've set a timer for 40 minutes. So after 40 minutes, I'll start to conclude, because my show is 45 minutes. And I call these the AC tapes because I'm in an air-conditioned room, thank God, because it's very warm here in Greece. And I'm practicing my show here in anticipation for going up to Edinburgh on the 11th and then doing my first show on the 12th. So without further ado, as they say, I'm not going to do any more adoing. Here is the first aspect of the introduction, and I've wrapped these up very small. Why this? Why am I talking about this? I'm talking about this because basically I'm talking about project management of software development in a very particular way. And the way that I'm talking about it is through the lens of different ways of seeing. And the reason I'm doing that, the reason I'm talking about it through the lens of different ways of seeing, is a line of inspiration that I got from a chap called Alan Kay. Now, you might not have heard of Alan Kay, but you've definitely either heard or seen things that he's been involved in. Slurp of tea there. So, Alan Kay was a researcher at something called Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. And at Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, in the 70s and 80s, they pretty much invented what we now call the personal computer. The mouse, the graphical user interface, the Ethernet, the networking, the laser printer, all of that stuff got invented at the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. Alan Kay was involved in some of that. And the thing that he said, which is the inspiration for the approach of this show and also the approach of my book, Delivering the Impossible, is that point of view is worth 80 IQ points. Now, what does he mean by that? What he means is that if we can see things in the right way, we can be much, much smarter about how we deal with them. So the difference, 80 IQ points, is the difference between being an ordinary person and being a genius for most people. But the crucial thing about that is that if we see things in the wrong way and we take away 80 IQ points, that's the difference for most of us from being a genius, not being a genius, being an ordinary person and an absolute idiot. So the idea here is that seeing things in the right way is very important. But also, I think kind of built into that, the idea of from Alan Kay is that seeing things in a bunch of different ways is helpful by itself. That the ability to see things in not just one way, like the idea that there's just one correct way of seeing software development, project management, isn't that great. It's not that helpful. There are multiple different ways of seeing project management or seeing anything, really. And if we can come up with a bunch of different ways of seeing things, hopefully helpful ways rather than ways that make us dumb and stupid, that in itself is going to be useful. Okay, so that's part of the introduction. So the next part of the introduction, again, I've wrapped these up tinily, is, I don't know why I've wrapped them up so angrily and tinily. Why now? Why should I be talking about software development, project management now? Well, I think this is a very important point in the history of software. And again, I've got a quote that I've used to take inspiration for this from a chap called Mark Anderson. Mark Anderson was involved in writing one of the first web browsers. So you know web browsers like Chrome or Safari or Edge. The first one of those, the first one that was commercially successful, was called Netscape, and Mark Anderson was involved in writing that. So, and then after that, he went on to kind of run a huge technology investment fund, and he's pretty much one of the main tech bros. He's kind of the tech bro nobody has ever heard of beyond Elon and Jeff Bezos, etc. So, and the inspiration, the quote from Mark Anderson that I took inspiration from is software is eating everything. So what does that mean? What does it mean that software is eating everything? Well, basically what Anderson meant, and he wrote this about 14 years ago now, I think it's 2010 that he wrote the paper where he wrote the blog post where he said this, is that every aspect of our lives is in some degree being consumed, being eaten by software. So let's say that you want to find love or you just want to hook up for a date, then you're probably going to use some kind of dating app. Let's say that you're hungry, then you're probably going to use something like Deliveroo or Uber Eats, or you're going to order your food from a supermarket and get it delivered. Let's say that you're looking for opinions, like trying to decide what you should think about the world, then you're probably going to decide that via social media. Lots and lots of aspects of our lives, and the more you think about it, the more you realize that it really is enormous parts of our lives, entertainment as well with things like Netflix. So that like software and all behind all of these things is software. And somebody has to write all that software. And somebody has to manage the writing of that software. And that's why I think I'm just about allowed to stick with the subtitle of this show, which is a short talk about how to rule the world. Because the people who know how to deliver this kind of software and are good at it, like Mark Zuckerberg, like Jeff Bezos, those people now are ruling the world. So I think it's legitimate to say that if I'm talking to you about software development, project management, I'm talking to you about ruling the world. Okay, another tightly wound little paper ball. Why you? Why should you be interested in this? Why should you be interested in software development? Well, I think there are three different, I'm holding three fingers up but not to the camera. I think there are three different groups of people who should be interested in what you have to say. And the first group is fairly straightforwardly people who are involved in software development in some way. So last time I did this show in Edinburgh, there were people in the audience who worked on software development projects. There was a guy who was just about to start a degree in computer science and AI. There are a lot of people who are involved in technology directly, and a lot of what I have to say is very relevant to those people. But then I think there's a second group. Now, so like you remember, I was talking about software devouring everything, and I talked about like aspects of our everyday lives. But also, of course, software is devouring enormous parts of our working lives. And so if you're involved in some kind of company that is dependent on some piece of software coming into being or is like having its business completely decimated because a competitor is using software and is kind of like beating you at your own game, if you somehow you're involved in a kind of professional capacity and software is starting to eat that environment, then I think also like what I have to say is relevant to you. And then there's a final group of people, and I think this is a bit cheeky, but I also think it's true. And that final group of people is everybody else. As I've said before when I was talking about things like Netflix and Uber Eats, etc., so many aspects of our lives are now being devoured by software. And so it's worth understanding a little bit about how software comes into being, how that process happens, how it gets managed. And so I think like who should be interested in this? Why you? Because either you're directly interested in software development or you're kind of tangentially connected to software development through your work, or you're a human being. I think those are the three main groups. And so finally, I can guess what this one is because I've unwrapped the other three. This is why me? Why should you listen to me talking about this? Well, I think there's a boring answer and then there's a slightly more interesting answer. The boring answer is a bit like a kind of CV. I've been doing this. I've been involved in software development depends how you count with a lot of these things, but like kind of quite often people date themselves by operating system. Okay, technical people date themselves by operating system. Normal people don't do that. But the first operating system that I used was before Windows 95, Windows 3.11. But I had a computer when I was 12. I didn't really know what I was buying, but I bought a computer mail order. I bought a ZX81 mail order. So I've been involved in computers since I was 12, which is 43 years ago. And I've been involved in software development since I was in my 20s, which is 30 years ago. So I've been doing this a long time. That's kind of a boring CV type answer. I've had lots of experience of delivering projects. I've had lots of experience of failing to deliver projects as well. I got to own up to that. Not all of the ones that I've worked on have been a success. So I have a lot of experience. But the other kind of slightly less boring or slightly weirder answer is I have a degree in philosophy. And so all the way through this process, I've been trying to make sense of what is a way, way more complicated and difficult thing than it should be. This is just, and we'll talk about this. We'll talk about the idea that like kind of it being straightforward and simple is a problem, or we might do that. But this is kind of fascinating to me, how difficult it is, how much of a struggle it is to kind of actually arrange to deliver useful software that's valuable to its users, valuable to its owners. Why is that such a struggle? And that's kind of something I've been fascinated by. And the things that I'm going to talk about when I talk about like different ways of seeing project management, they come from that kind of area. So that's kind of why me. Okay, so that's the introduction, which took 12 minutes. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw subjects and keep talking about them until I run out of time, basically, and then I'll do some kind of summary, and this will constitute a show. And the first one that I've drawn here, just so you know I'm not cheating, is chapter ship. So this is a chapter in the book where I talk about improvisation, and then I move on to kind of a certain way of seeing projects. So I've done some improvisation theatre because I live in North London, or I have lived in North London, and that's the kind of thing you have to do if you live in North London. And one of the really, really interesting things for me about improvisational theatre is that when people get on the stage, they get scared. And when they get scared, they do really kind of predictable sorts of things. So imagine that a bunch of improvisers are on the stage, and it's their class showcase at the end of the 10 weeks or ever, and they've managed to persuade people who don't know what improvisational class showcases are like to come along and be in the audience. And they ask for some kind of, so it says 4 people on the stage, and they ask for some kind of suggestion for a place that they might improvise, use as an improvisation scene. And somebody says the deck of a ship. So you've got 4 people, they're kind of thinking, oh God, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And one of the people, one of the more enterprising ones, mimes a telescope, looks at the horizon and says, oh look, a pirate ship. Now, from this point onwards, this is something that you learn if you go to enough improvisation courses. What the audience wants to see is they want to see this crew engage with the pirate ship. They want to see who's on the pirate ship. They want to see a fight. They want to see the pirate king or the captain or whatever, the pirate queen or the captain. I think it's a non-gender word, isn't it, captain? So that's what they want to see. But very often what happens in this kind of situation is that somebody else amongst those 4 improvisers will say something like, let's clean the decks. So this is a very boring suggestion. It doesn't advance the story forward. It doesn't entertain the audience, but it's very appealing to naive or kind of inexperienced naive or inexperienced improvisers, because it's kind of safe, in inverted commas. They can all mime scrubbing the decks. They all kind of know what they're doing, and nobody is kind of sticking out and offering the potential for humiliation. And there's a guy who writes about improvisation, one of the kind of improvisation pioneers in the UK, is a chap called Keith Johnston. And he calls this kind of falling back into doing something that's safe, that looks like activity but isn't really activity, that's boring for the audience. He calls this agreed activity. So this is kind of like people agreeing to do something that looks like work but actually isn't work. And something very similar can happen in software development. A team can be working along and they can spot a problem on the horizon, like a pirate ship on the horizon. And then rather than tackling that pirate ship, they just fall into some agreed activity. So they fall into some kind of way of working, which looks like working, but isn't actually advancing the project, because the only way that the project is really going to advance is if the team tackles the pirate ship that's coming on the horizon. So they prepare for it, or they sail towards it and actually try and tackle it. So this is kind of a one way of seeing projects, and one way of seeing how you might make projects more successful. How might you make projects more successful? How might you make projects more successful? Well, one way that you could make projects more successful is by spotting the threats that are on the horizon and actually dealing with them. Now, why might a team be tempted to not deal with threats that are on the horizon? Well, one reason why they might be tempted to not deal with threats that are on the horizon is that previously, when they've tried to point out these threats to the leadership, the captain, the admiral, whoever's in charge, they've been shot. Now, obviously, in most workplaces, I'm talking about being shot in a metaphorical sense, but really what I'm talking about here is that they've tried to identify, they've tried to kind of talk about things that are on the horizon that the project really needs to tackle. And somebody in management has essentially growled at them. They've kind of said, oh, I'm tired of hearing about this negativity, blah, 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 blah. And the reality is that if anybody ever deals with reports of pirate ships in that way, the team will nearly instantly learn that they should never point out pirate ships. And so what you need to do, if you're in charge of a project, and if you're a senior stakeholder, as they say, if you're a boss connected with the project, is you need to be very careful that whenever the team points out problems that they're experiencing, that you don't do that. You don't shoot the messenger, because if you do, then guess what? You'll never hear anything bad from that project again, right up to the point where it fails. One of the interesting things that Johnston talks about in one of his books, he's written two books, one called Impro and the other one called Impro for Storytellers. I'm not sure which one it's in. But he talks about when he's trying to get improvisers in a show to make the improvisation more realistic and to move the action forward rather than falling into this agreed activity, that one of the ways you can set up the improvisation is to have a director as part of the setup, as part of the show. And the role of the director is to spot when the improvisers have fallen into this agreed activity and say to them, tackle the pirate ship, sail towards the pirate ship's already here, start fighting with the pirates. So one of the roles that you can have from a kind of management point of view is not just to be kind of receptive to reports of pirate ships when they come along, but also to encourage the team to deal with those if they've kind of fallen into the trap of agreed activity. Okay, so that's pirate ships. And now I'm going to talk about something else. And I'm wondering if I'm going to be able to connect it together. Let's see. I really did tie these up tightly. Okay, so this is probably the most complicated aspect of the book. And it's certainly the only aspect of the book that deals with a Chilean psychoanalyst and psychologist. The name of the Chilean psychoanalyst and psychologist is Ignacio. I'm trying a Spanish pronunciation, but apologies if that's terrible. Ignacio Mat Blanco. So Ignacio Mat Blanco, he wrote books in the 60s, and he was concerned. He had this idea, which when I read about it, I thought was absolutely fascinating from the point of view of project management, because it matches so well with so many of the things that you see in project management. And the idea that Ignacio Blanco had was that there are essentially two, I'm holding up two fingers, there are two different ways of thinking about the world. I mean, obviously there are lots and lots of different ways of thinking about the world, but he's drawing this distinction between these two types of way, these two ways of looking at the world. The one is looking at the world in terms of same and all and forever. And the other is looking at the world in terms of different and some and for a while. It's very interesting that certainly in English we struggle to come up with a decent kind of opposite of forever. For a while, for a bit, for a short space of time, something like that. And so this is the kind of first idea of Ignacio Mat Blanco, that there are these two ways of seeing the world. And he calls one of these ways symmetrical, so that's the same, all, forever. He calls that a symmetrical way of thinking. And he calls the other way of thinking, some, different, for a short space of time, asymmetrical. The second thing that Ignacio Mat Blanco says is that our subconscious mind favors the symmetrical way of thinking over the asymmetrical way of thinking. So if we're not thinking, if we're just processing the world subconsciously, unconsciously, we will tend to think about the world in terms of all and same and forever. Now, one example of this that I give in the book is that it's very, very difficult for us to see the world from anybody else's point of view. We tend to kind of think that there's this thing called the curse of knowledge. We tend to think that people know what we know and see what we see. And of course, the reality is that they don't do that. That's not how the world works. And this is just an example of this unconscious way, conscious way that we kind of tend to think about the world in terms of all and same. So all people see what we see. All people have the same kind of view. Another thing is that that Ignacio Mat Blanco points out that in this kind of subconscious view, nothing ever comes into being. Things that you learn, you kind of as if you've always known them, and you never imagine that they're going to change. Now, this is obviously a bit of a conflict with project management and trying to bring things into being, because the nature of bringing things into being is that there's a state when they don't exist, and then there's a state when they do exist. Now, remember I said that kind of why I like this idea of some and different and for a short space of time over same and all and forever, is that it has these weird kind of echoes, these weird kind of... it basically explains some of the most weird behavior that you see in projects. One of the things that you see over and over and over again in projects is that you see that people can't prioritize things. That kind of, if you ask them, so a typical thing that you do using a kind of agile approach, which is the approach to software development that I use, which is kind of, the idea is that it's iterative and incremental. So you do a little bit, and then you see how that's done, and then you do a bit more. You kind of continuously improve. And one of the things that you need to do, if you're going to take that kind of approach, is that you need to kind of decide what you're going to do first, and then what you're going to do after that. And very often when you try and get senior people to kind of prioritize a list and say, okay, so which one of these things should we take first? The response that you get is, I don't care, because I want all of them. And that is symmetrical thinking. That is basically, that's the subconscious saying, yeah, I just want all of them. And in order to actually get any useful kind of approach when you're doing software development, what you need to do is you need to start taking things one at a time, and you need to start being able to take priorities. Like, so you're going to do this before you do the next thing. So that's one thing about the sum and all is not being able to prioritize. The other thing is, you remember I talked about this thing about like kind of symmetry and asymmetry. The really, really weird thing about and symmetry and asymmetry, and in a subconscious world, nothing really comes into being. One of the weirdest things that you see when people talk about projects is that after they've had the idea, somehow the project kind of exists already, that there isn't anything else to be done, that kind of once the idea has happened, then the project kind of already exists. And this, of course, isn't true, but it is true to the subconscious mind. And so one of the things that you're kind of weirdly having to do when you manage projects is to try and persuade people who had the idea. It's kind of two things, really. You're going to try to persuade people who had the idea that just because they had the idea, the thing doesn't already exist. There's still work that needs to be done. And it's not just handle turning work. That's the other thing. So it's not just that kind of, they've had the idea and now people just need to do a little bit of typing, which I think is often what people imagine. Rather than that, what it is like, you have the idea that now we have to make the reality. And this is kind of like another way that I've kind of come to start explaining the difference between sum and all and symmetrical and asymmetrical ways of seeing the world. Symmetrical is essentially the description on the biscuit tin. And also, like, thinking of things symmetrically is thinking that there is a direct mirroring, that word symmetrical means mirror. There is a direct mirroring between the description of something, so the idea that somebody had of something, and the actual thing itself, that those things can be kind of put in like one-to-one correlation with each other. Asymmetrical thinking is understanding that the biscuit and the biscuit tin are very different things. They're not the same. And asymmetrical thinking is about putting the focus on the biscuit rather than biscuit tin. What is valuable about biscuits in comparison with biscuit tins? It seems weird that you have to kind of mention this, but this is something that very often you end up having to talk about when you're doing projects. And of course, the difference between a biscuit and a biscuit tin is that you can eat a biscuit. A biscuit has genuine value, it has genuine nourishment, whereas the biscuit tin is just a description. And so kind of, this is something that it's an absolutely crucial part of project management of anything, I think, not just software development. And it's something that I've not heard anybody talk about anywhere else. And part of the reason is because organizations find it very, very difficult to deal in biscuits. Organizations are set up to send messages to each other and talk about things that aren't biscuits. They're set up to deal in descriptions of things and PowerPoints of things and reports about descriptions and PowerPoints. They're not set up to deal with the actual biscuit. And the actual biscuit that you have in software development is something that in order to get it right, you can't just do like follow one recipe and then that's it. In order to get it right, in order to can really succeed, you have to actually talk to people and find out what the actual value of this biscuit is. So that's another kind of aspect of the symmetrical asymmetrical divide, is that asymmetrically you imagine that you already know what the value of this thing is, whereas symmetrically you imagine you already know what the value of this thing is, whereas asymmetrically you realize that you're going to have to go and find it out. Okay, so that was a stagger through symmetrical and asymmetrical, and I'm just going to take one more subject. I'm going to do 8 minutes on another subject, and then I'm going to do a conclusion. Here we go, and this one is commit. So this is the other kind of big kind of heavyweight chapter at the end of my book, which is about commitment and consistency. So we're kind of programmed to keep our promises and be consistent with the things that we say. A lot of the inspiration for this chapter in my book is from a chap called Robert Cialdini, who wrote a book called Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion. And in that he talks about lots of experiments, these are the kind of experiments that psychologists do, where people get manipulated into doing things that they wouldn't necessarily want to do. And the way that they're manipulated into doing these things is by somebody extracting a very low level of commitment from them. So, for example, somebody rings you up and says to you, would you like to stand outside the supermarket on Saturday with one of those tins, shaking the tin, collecting for a charity? And if you do that, if you ring people up and you ask them that question, then the percentage of people who will sign up to do that is predictably low. It's 20, 30%. I'm surprised it's that much. But there's something that you can do to substantially increase the number of people who will say yes to that very unattractive proposal. And the thing that you can do, and this is kind of like, absolutely crazy, the thing that you can do is a week beforehand, you can ring that same person and ask them just this simple question. Do you think charity is a good thing? That's it. So all you do is ask them that question. Most people say yes to that. Nearly nobody says, no, I think charity is a bad thing. But once you've answered yes to that question, if a week later somebody rings you up and asks you to, will you turn up and shake a tin for a charity, your chances of saying yes to that are much, much higher. So this is kind of this crazy thing. We are powerfully guided by commitment and consistency. Very often when people talk about project management, so like I do an exercise when I'm doing project management courses at the beginning where I ask people to draw a stick person and write down around that stick person all of the words and phrases that they associate with a project that's going well, with a project that's going that's happy. And almost the first thing that anybody ever writes down is on time and to budget. And on time and to budget is about keeping a promise. So most people, like intuitively, and very often these are people who've got some kind of skill or experience in project management who are coming in my courses, people tend to think that project management is about keeping promises. Unfortunately, the point at which you're making these kinds of promises when you're in a project, you're saying, I'm going to deliver this by this time, is the point at which you have least information about that project. You don't really know much about it. And my experience is that at that point, you really pretty much know that whatever you're promising and for whatever time, that's not likely going to be the real thing that really happens. And so there is this kind of like paradox at the heart of project management that's connected to commitment and consistency, which is that people pretty much think that project management is about commitment and consistency, but anybody who does it knows that there isn't really anything that you can commit to and be consistent to, certainly at the beginning of a project. So this is kind of like a fundamental, contradiction, but it's worse than that. And the reason it's worse than that is because of what Cialdini calls commitment and consistency jiu-jitsu. So that is that very often the kind of commitment that you're asked to make if you're the project team for a project, it isn't kind of an honest commitment about what you can do in kind of what kind of time. Very often, it's manipulated in some way. So the typical way that it's manipulated is to say, we're only going to give you this work if you commit to it, and your commitment is less than other people who've made this commitment. So there's some kind of like manipulation of it. So very often it's not just that there's this kind of inherent contradiction because you're trying to make a commitment to the point when you really don't know what's going on. There's this other kind of aspect to it as well, which is that you'll be manipulated into making a commitment that you know that you can't make. So this is kind of a really weird thing about commitment and consistency. And one of the things that you've got to do when you're working on a project is to kind of understand. Well, here's a quote from a chap called Ralph Waldo Emerson. And often the quote is truncated to commitment is the hobgoblin of little minds. But the full quote, or a fuller quote, is a foolish commitment is the hobgoblin of little minds. And what that means is, and I think this is a really useful distinction to draw, especially when you're a project manager, is that there is basically, this is what I've realized, there's no way of avoiding the bad feelings that you will feel from at some point having made a commitment to deliver on a certain kind of thing, and then at another point realizing that you're not going to be able to deliver on that. There isn't even a way, I haven't found one anyway, of feeling bad about not delivering on commitments that have been manipulated. But there is a way of realizing when you've been, that you shouldn't feel bad for a foolish commitment. So if you've been manipulated into a commitment and you know that this commitment was never really going to make any kind of sense at all, then that's a foolish commitment, and there shouldn't be any kind of bad feeling on your part for not honouring or not managing to deliver on that foolish commitment. As I said, in my experience, you still probably will feel a little bad, but kind of like it helps to bear in mind that this is a foolish commitment. The other thing to bear in mind here is that kind of you can still deliver something that's hugely valuable on a project and not meet your commitments at all. So you can end up delivering something that's massively valuable to the organisation, that's not on budget and not on time, and isn't what was initially promised, but is still extremely useful and extremely valuable. And one of the things that kind of like is amazing to me is that quite often when you talk to project managers, they've been involved in delivering something that's hugely productive and hugely valuable. But in their head, they can still feel the shame because what they delivered wasn't on time, wasn't on budget, wasn't what was originally committed to, even if the original commitment was a foolish commitment. Okay, so that was 40 minutes, and I'm just going to recap now, and I'm going to finish bang on 45 because I'm a project manager and I like my meetings to finish on time. So, why me? I've been doing this a really long time. I've been doing project management a long time. Why you? You live in the world. The world is being eaten by software, and so you should probably have a better idea of what software is and how you can manage it and how to deliver it. Why now? I've just kind of mentioned that. Software is devouring everything. Software is eating every aspect of our lives. The people who know how to deliver software, how to get software written, how to own software, those people are ruling the world. And why me? Why you? Why now? Why this? Because I hope I've shown that by seeing things in a bunch of different ways, you can get a better handle on them. You have a chance of kind of making them work in ways that otherwise wouldn't have been successful. And what are the three ways that I've talked about? Well, the three ways that I've talked about, can I remember them? What was the first one? Some ship. So, yes. How do you make your projects deliverable, even the impossible looking ones? Well, if they've got problems, if they've got ships on the horizon, you and your team should tackle those ships. You shouldn't encourage your team to get involved in agreed activity and not mention things that are on the horizon. So you should be positive and welcoming and reassuring when they point out difficulties. If they do fall into agreed activity, you should encourage them out of it. You should tackle the pirate ship that's on the horizon. What was the second one? Summit and all. It's a big, old, complicated topic. There's a difference between a description of a thing and the thing itself. And the subconscious mind will fall in love with the description and think that nothing else is needed to be done. Also, the subconscious mind will really, really struggle with the idea of doing a bit of something rather than doing all of it. But the only way that you can do a big thing is by doing a little thing. So you need to kind of understand the difference between symmetrical and asymmetrical of descriptions of things. And you need to be able to understand strategies for basically talking people down off the ledge of wanting everything and getting them to focus on delivering something as a first step towards delivering everything. And then finally, what was the last one? God, my memory today is terrible. Chapter commit. So people think that project management's about keeping promises. You're not going to change that. You're not going to change people thinking that project management is all about, or pretty much all about, keeping promises. But project management isn't about keeping promises. Project management is about delivering something that's valuable to the people who use it and valuable to the people who funded it. And so what you're trying to do always when you're in a project is you're trying to play this kind of weird game of, yes, sort of honouring the commitments that you were manipulated into, but also trying to find what's genuinely valuable. And one of the things that happens, I didn't mention this earlier, but I'm going to talk about it now, is one of the things that happens is that if you can finally connect this thing to something that's valuable on the outside with users, and that starts to pay off, it starts to pay off for the organization, then they just might, to some degree, forget what the initial commitment was and focus on the thing that they've got, the biscuit, rather than the biscuit tin. Okay, that was a full run through. It was a bit hairy in places, but on the whole, I'm pretty happy with it.